You wrote in a recent Substack roundtable that you guys do. It's like you, Mark Stein, like a bunch of people do it, and you guys are doing
Mhm.
it like occasionally. I don't know exactly how long, how often, but you wrote that defense isn't dead, and that was like a key trend for you. What did you mean
Mhm.
by that?
I feel like all of the talk this season has been about like how teams have solved offense, and that's the problem with the NBA, and how like it's all just everybody takes and makes too many threes, and like we need to figure out ways to make defenses better. Defenses are better this season. Scoring is down almost 2 points per 100 possessions. That's like the first time in a while where it's down at least down a significant amount. Like that's a pretty big difference year over year to go up or down 2 points per 100 possessions. Generally, offenses do get a little bit better over the course of the season, but going up, 2 full points per 100 possessions to get where they were last year, or to show the type of improvement year over year that we've seen in some seasons, that's a lot from now to the end of the year. I don't know if you can expect that to happen. We've also seen like some of the best defenses in recent memory. Like this Oklahoma City defense has been the best in the league so far this season. Even last night, they held the Bucks, well below expectation of where their offense has been throughout the season. The problem for OKC was on offense. So the Bucks this year, I haven't checked the numbers this morning, but coming into last night, that defense was like the second best in like modern NBA history since the merger in 1976 in terms of how much better it is than the league average defense. The only defense better was like one of the early 2000s Spurs teams,
Hmm.
where basically if the league average in a given season is like 90 points per 100 possessions and you allow 99, then your defense is 10% worse than average. If you allow 81, your defense is 10% better than average. So a defense that gives up 90 points per 100 possessions in a season where the league average is 90 is not as good as one that gives up 95 in a season where the league average is 100. Like, so this OKC defense has been better than a lot of defenses that have been better on a per possession basis. You look, the Rockets are in like the top 10, 15 in that same measurement. The Magic are in the top 20 in that same measurement. We've had a lot of really, really good defenses this year, better than a lot in recent memory. And the league average overall is down. So, like, defenses are better this year, but all everybody talks about is how teams have solved offense and we have to, limit the number of threes or move the 3 point line back or, cap the number of corner threes or whatever. Like, I think to me, it's more about defenses need to step their games up. And some defenses really have, whether it's in scheme or execution. And I think we saw the same thing in the NFL where people were like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Defenses can't play. And then, we saw defenses innovate. We saw teams decide we're going to take away deep passing instead
Right.
of taking
Too high
away.
shell. Yeah.
Right. We're going to take away deep passing instead of taking away runs, which has been the foundation of defense since football has started. And we've seen now that teams can take away runs even while taking away deep passing. And we've seen teams go like, you watch the Vikings play defense, what they're doing is insane. Like, where is the NFL version of that where you're just doing stuff that is so much different than everybody else in the league and it forces teams to adjust? Where is even the NBA version of like what Tom Thibodeau did in the 90s and early 2000s, where they literally had to change the rules of offense so that teams could combat what they were doing defensively? I don't think we're seeing enough defensive innovation at a level that is commensurate with what we're seeing offensively to force offenses to adjust back. And I think that that's the thing we need to see more than like changing the rules so you can't shoot as many threes anymore.
I'm glad you brought up Thibodeau because I was gonna talk about him. Yeah, you reminded me of him when you were talking, and you see those schematic shifts, right? Like you see guys kind of go into the low post, and then you do that, and then you got Thibodeau kind of doing what he's doing, and then you see maybe like a little bit of schematic experimentation out of Miami with Eric Spoelstra with this zone defense, but that's just kind of more like well, what we're doing right now isn't working. Let's just kind of go with this throwback. It's almost like running like a wing tee in the NFL because nothing else is working. But it's
And
like
teams are doing that now too, by the
right.
way. Teams are breaking out
It's
like wing T stuff, different formations, but these fake toss inside handoff to the guy coming back. Like that's Wayne T stuff.
Yeah, what's old is new again. It's funny in every
Yeah.
way, but um, I think maybe instead of the schematic changes, I think it's more maybe of a roster building change that we're seeing defensively because the big trend in offense over these last 10, 15 years, I guess, has been the high pick and roll, right? And it
Mhm.
was just every team running pick and roll and pick and roll. And what you would do is, hey, call up the guy with the weakest defender on him, bring him into my screen. Our best offensive player has the ball in his hands, and he's going to pick on your worst defensive player. And we're just going to do
Mhm.
that. And we're going to spam that over and over and over again. And I think what front offices have realized is, oh my God, we can't have weak defenders on our team. We can't have these weak links on the court. Maybe one at a time, but we can't have multiples of them because that just kind of gives a smorgasbord to these great players who are doing this.
Mhm.
James Harden, LeBron James, whatever, and then obviously the players now who are doing it. And so I think they've kind of flushed their rosters uh, of those weak defenders and then started filling them with like strong defenders. And you look at like a team like even like Orlando, it's who's the bad defender in their rotation? Who's even in Atlanta, Trey Young is certainly not a great defender, but they've surrounded him with like four good to elite defenders at all times. And maybe that's what it is. It's like, okay, like we had a lot of places that you could pick on before. You're not going to have quite as many of those places that you could pick on anymore. And I just look at the way that the smart front offices are building. Even Boston wins the championship last year. Everybody talks about their defense and the 3-point shooting there, or their offense rather, and their 3-point shooting. Their defense is what carried them to the championship last year. That's what made them so dominant, right? Charlotte is also shooting 53 pointers per game, and they stink because they can't stop anybody. So it's the other part of it that you need, right? It's that 3 and D. So yeah, maybe I don't know. I'm kind of just thinking out loud here. I hadn't thought about this until you started talking, but maybe it's more of like a personnel shift as opposed to a schematic shift.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. Something that Seth Partnow talks about a lot is that, especially when you get to the playoffs, a lot of times it is about being able to mitigate weaknesses as much as it is having strengths, and not having any weak points defensively is one of the best ways that you can do that. I also think you need to be able to do multiple things defensively. If you only have one way you can play defense, you're going to get beat. Like,
Hmm.
no matter how good your defense is. A few years ago, that Knicks Hawks series, the Knicks were really good defensively during the regular season, but they only had one way they could play. And once Trae Young figured it out, that series was over.
Yep.
And we saw that in the NBA Cup quarterfinals too, where the Knicks in the first half they did really well against Trae, and he didn't have an assist I think until like a couple minutes left in the first half. Early in the second half, he figured it out, and it was the game was just over at that point because the Hawks could do whatever they wanted offensively, and the Knicks offense sort of ground down to a halt. You got to be able to do everything, and you got to be able to have guys on the court where, at the very least, you can cover for their weaknesses, and preferably you want to not have any weaknesses out there. I do think that the zone stuff is something more teams should explore, even if it's just as a nothing else is working for us. And I think teams need to get more exotic with the way they play zones too. That's the thing that I brought up, like with the Vikings in the NFL. They a lot of times will run blitzes and play zone behind it, and
Hmm.
that is not something that teams usually do. I think having more than just like a standard 2-3, 3-2, 1-3-1, like having zones that change shapes on within a given possession, or from like if the ball goes here, this is how we're going to play this zone. If the ball goes there, this is how we're going to play this zone, and it sort of changes shapes so teams don't necessarily know what you're doing throughout the entire possession. I think that like we're going to play zone. One possession it's going to be 3-2. One possession it's going to be 1-3-1. Like changing things up so teams don't know what they're getting. I think that something I wrote about a couple of years ago is putting more pressure in the backcourt to make teams waste time so they don't have as much time to run their offense. I think that is something that we need to see more of. It's really hard to do from like, especially to ask your starters to do it
Hmm.
because they play so many minutes. But maybe that's a thing, like have your starters play 30 minutes instead of 34, 36 minutes, and you can ask them to do it a little bit more. Like one of the things we see with the Rockets, obviously Dylan Brooks will guard you literally anywhere on the floor. They bring in Aaron Holiday, he's guarding 92 feet from the basket every second that he's on the court. Amen Thompson, Tari Easton, they're guarding you everywhere when you're on the court. And like maybe they're not doing it as much with Fred VanVleet or Jalen Green or whoever, but those other guys, they're doing it every single second. And
Right.
having more guys that you're willing to do that with, whether it's in your starting lineup, maybe you don't play your starters 36 minutes a night because you're willing to do more defensively than other teams are.
Right. These guys are almost like your pass rush specialists. It's like your blitz package. I think we're just going to do the whole show just like relating the NBA to the NFL and just keep this metaphor
I
going.
do think it's
But it's
instructive. Like you should be able to take ideas from
yeah,
other sports or from
100%.
college football or wherever. Like that's something that you see in the NFL all the time too. Andy Reid will get ideas from high school teams that he watches on tape. Like you got to be willing to steal from anywhere, not just other NBA coaches, but college basketball, women's basketball. Go look at what WNBA teams are doing. Like I don't personally watch that much because I already cover two sports full time, but I'm sure that there is innovative stuff that you could try coming from there too.
One of the other schematic things, or maybe it's a little schematic, it's just more about prioritizing things. I watched the Oklahoma City Thunder play defense, and we know about their deflection rates, their steal rates, they're turning the team over at one out of every other five possessions, and all these things. And I think about as everybody becomes good at shooting the basketball, like everybody is just so good at shooting, so good at scoring, generally speaking, especially when you compare this era to past eras, that defense has gotten so much harder because there's just so many guys you have to account for. And no matter how well you guard sometimes, good shooters are going to make tough shots.
Mm.
And I find it interesting that Oklahoma City has decided, you know what, instead of actually contesting the shot, we're just going to take the ball away from you and you're never going to get the shot. I think steals and blocks are never going to be more important than they are maybe over these next few years, where it's just like, you know what, we're not even going to let you take this shot because everybody's making this at a 35, 36% clip anyway. Doesn't matter. We're just going to take the ball away from you. And then obviously, that fuels your transition offense and all of those things. But that value of steal the ball equals a stop, score on the other end, those little stop and score swings, I think that stuff is going to be so important going forward.
Yeah, I think tracking like pick sixes is a good idea. And I'm glad you brought this up because I actually wrote about this earlier in the season in terms of like teams are trying to force more turnovers now. Like they are putting more effort into that. For a while, like I remember I wrote for 538 a bunch of years ago where like the other revolution in the NBA was just like nobody was ever turning the ball over anymore. And I think some of that was teams were trying to minimize fouls, and as a result, were playing very passive defense and weren't forcing as many turnovers. I think one of the biggest things you could do defensively now is find a way to force turnovers and not foul at the same time. If you can do that, you're going to be a leg up on every other defense. I also think crashing the offensive glass more often so that your opponent doesn't have as many possessions, like figuring out a way to win the possession battle in terms of force more turnovers than your opponent, get more offensive rebounds than your opponent, and foul less often than your opponent is huge. That's something that I have up on the site now is like tracking the who's winning the possession battle on a night-to-night basis. Very unsurprisingly, 4 of the teams in the top 5, Oklahoma City, Houston, Boston, Orlando.
There you go. Well, I did want to ask you, so, here are the top 10 defenses by defensive rating so far. Oklahoma City, Houston, Orlando, Minnesota, the Clippers, Memphis, Golden State, Boston, Cleveland, Miami. Those are your top 10 defenses. You're welcome to pick any other defenses, but just for the sake of the listener, I wanted to kind of give the top 10. But if you were just sort of, I guess, building your own playoff team, and you got to just pick one defensive unit, that's your defense for the playoffs, which one of these defenses would you want for a playoff series?
Oh, Boston. Like,
Same. Yeah.
It's not even like it's not close, honestly. Like, if you tell me that like Porzingis is healthy and Horford is healthy, so you have the options there, like no question for me.
Yeah, obviously, Oklahoma City is number one. You already read the stats about how they're so elite over this last era, and then Houston's obviously great. But to me, Boston is like, first of all, foot a little bit off the gas, right? Like they're not all the way in the left lane going through the express. They're kind of in the middle lane taking their time. They know where they're going. Still just sort of a walking, like out, just roll out of bed, top 10 defense. They have everything, right? They have the length, they have the great point of attack defenders with White and Holiday, and then more importantly, and what they have that Oklahoma City, Houston don't really have is the length with Tatum, Brown. They've got Porzingis. Would have been really interesting to see that NBA Cup game, by the way, if Chet Holmgren had been involved, just to see like that body match with Giannis. But Boston's got all the stuff, and as long as they're healthy, I agree with you. I think they're going to easily be the best defense in the playoffs, and that could just be the thing that matters. in the
Yeah,
end.
I mean, like they have two guys that are at their best, all NBA caliber defenders that are the third and fourth best perimeter defenders in their starting lineup. Like Tatum and Brown are really, really good defenders. They would be the best perimeter defenders on most teams in the league. And like they are pretty clearly the third and fourth best defenders in their own starting lineup, which is insane to think about.
Absolutely wild.